The presidents of the 1970s, particularly Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, are roundly regarded, though I think history will treat them both a little better than we do now, by the perception that they were incompetent. And whether they were or not, the perception of their incompetence made the 1970s a particularly difficult time politically for the United States, in domestic policy of the United States. I think again, that historians will treat both Ford and Carter a little better than they're treated politically right now, but we'll have to wait to see about that. Let's run through these two presidents relatively quickly. Gerald Ford was president from 1974 to 1977, just as the inflation part of stagflation really began to hammer away at the American economy. In fact, he believed that inflation was worse than business stagnation, and that he was not as cognizant as maybe he could have been, certainly as we are much later in hindsight, of the impact of the oil embargo. He looked at the oil embargo much more so as a political issue than as an economic affront to the economy of the United States, and didn't really understand the impact, or didn't act on an understanding of the impact. Gerald Ford was from Michigan. He had been in the House of Representatives. He was one of the Republicans that worked diligently to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. And in 1973, he was appointed vice president when Richard Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign because he was convicted of criminal activity as governor of Maryland, when he was governor of Maryland. And so Gerald Ford I believe he might be the only president of the United States who never actually ever stood for any kind of election to the office. He was not elected vice president. He was appointed as vice president when Spiro Agnew had to resign, and then he became president in 1974 when Richard Nixon was forced to resign. And in the spirit of healing, and you can put that in quotation marks, he pardoned Richard Nixon for any crimes Nixon might have committed. And he did this in September of 1974, which pretty much doomed his presidency. It was going to be almost impossible to get reelected or to get elected for the first time when he ran for president in 1976, because so many people wanted Nixon to have to go to some kind of trial. Now, whether fairly or unfairly, there was so much anger at Nixon that Ford really had to have some political courage to pardon Nixon in 1974. Nixon went on to be rehabilitated, but Ford has yet to be rehabilitated. And one of the problems with Ford's rehabilitation is that he was faced with this deteriorating economy, and unemployment was high, inflation was high, demand was low, businesses were shutting down. And he was an economic moderate who enraged both his Republican fellows and the Democrats, and came up with ineffectual jawboning policies rather than a strong medicine for the economy. And this was summed up in his WIN campaign. Wear a button that says WIN, and like the Blue Eagle campaign, you will revive the economy, which didn't happen under the Blue Eagle and did not happen under the Whip Inflation Now program. Unfortunately for Ford, that was the only thing he came up with that got out into the public. And so people tagged him with WIN, Whip Inflation Now, and it made him look just terribly weak and terribly lackluster. In foreign policy, he had a lot of the same haplessness. He was president in 1975 when North Vietnam invaded and conquered South Vietnam. The images that you may remember having seen of helicopters flying off the top of the Saigon embassy with hundreds of people trying to get on the last couple of helicopters happened under the Ford presidency. And while there's probably not much he could ever have done about that, people in the United States blamed him for that kind of humiliation. And on top of his economic problems and the pardoning of Nixon, then Ford was not going to be president for a long time. He continued Nixon's detente with the USSR and with China, but did not promote it very effectively, did not move it forward very effectively, didn't seem to pay much attention to it. He just didn't want to go back to the old Cold War threats of bombing one another. And he was unsuccessful at brokering a peace in the Middle East. So he appeared to be a hapless failure. He was only president for 3 years and did not even have a real political constituency. So it's a little hard to blame him. He and his successor, Jimmy Carter, ran a tough campaign in 1976, which Carter won. But Carter was stymied by much of the same things that stymied Ford, whereas Ford had been a minor player and was considered an outsider because he was appointed to the presidency, considered by the Washington elite as an outsider. Jimmy Carter had never been elected to a federal office. He was the former governor of Georgia and ran as an outsider. And so when he got to Washington, D.C., the Washington elite hamstrung him, and he hamstrung himself. He was very forward-thinking, but he did not understand how to sell his policies to the Washington elite or to the American people who amazingly enough, pay a lot of attention to the Washington elite. And some of the things he did seemed to be weak and namby-pamby. That is, far too humanitarian and far too little realpolitik. Then all of a sudden he'd shift gears and do something bizarre that was way too ham-handed in foreign policy. So it was like he was somewhat rudderless. He had an unsuccessful and very badly politicked policy to get the U.S. off of foreign oil that ended up being exploited by his political enemies to make him look weak. Many thought that he should have forced OPEC to obey the United States. Well, that wasn't going to happen. There was no way that we could force them except by going to war with places like Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing countries of the Middle East to require them to do what we wanted them to do. But many people in the U.S. considered that a sign of weakness. They wanted a really robust military policy that simply pounded our enemies into the ground. And his policy on U.S. Getting off of foreign oil was repudiated in Congress because he had not prepared the members properly to accept it, to work with him on this. Stagflation for him was still a serious issue. Unemployment remained high, inflation remained high, and the federal budget was badly unbalanced because receipts had been so out of whack with expenditures. And inflation made the borrowing that we had done very expensive to pay off. This long-term, this decade-long intractability in the economy led to the rise of conservative critics, not so much of Carter, but of Great Society programs and the Great Society concept of the role of government in the economy, that is to nurture the economy and to help distribute the goods of the economy. Consequently, there was so much pressure from the right that Carter began moving to the right, which made him look wishy-washy. He had kind of centrist leftist rhetoric, but his policies were easily identified with the political right in the United States, and so he looked like he was just blowing with whatever wind was economically was pushing him at the moment, which never plays well in politics. And it opened the door to an ongoing move to the right. Not only did it open the door, but Carter assisted this move of the political center rightward. And policymaking to the right. Now, in foreign policy, we see that he paired left and right wing attempts. At first, he granted amnesty to Vietnam-era draft resistors, angering many conservatives. He favored negotiation over confrontation in foreign policy, which was part and parcel of the UN mandate, but having been stung by the end of the war in Vietnam, many American militarists decidedly wanted some kind of victory and did not want to jawbone and talk. They wanted action. Carter, interestingly enough, looked beyond the bipolar U.S. communist world to see a wider world, a multipolar world that was beginning to be dominated by developing nations, and one that had to take developing nations, former colonies, into account. Yet he did not prepare the political ground, and so it made him and people who thought like him appear to be weak, and they were outdistanced and outclassed politically by people who wanted to make a strong, ongoing U.S. presence in the world, primarily a military presence in the world. Carter negotiated the turning over of the Panama Canal to Panama at the end of the U.S.'s 99-year lease, which many conservatives considered to be just another giveaway of American assets. He negotiated, and this was a great success that didn't play out all that well eventually because it's an intractable problem, but he negotiated the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel in 1978. This was a major milestone in Israeli-Arab relations. Carter was actually able to get the Israelis, the Israeli government and the Egyptian government to recognize one another. And Egypt actually recognized the right of Israel to exist in 1978. This was 30 years after Israel had actually existed, that the Egyptian government agreed to stop fighting an existential war against Israel. And this led to some softening. It also led to a situation in which the United States, in order to support this Camp David Accord, continually supported dictators as the rulers of Egypt. Carter, in 1979, recognized Red China and established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. And he embarked on a worldwide campaign for human rights, which was something of a repudiation of the hardline anti-communist Nixon doctrine. But it was hard to achieve actual successes. It's a long-term project. And again, without actual success, made Carter look weak. Two things he did that were probably a little too ham-handed and yet didn't satisfy the conservatives who by this time hated him because of all these other things that were going on in his term of office. In 1980, because of the USSR's invasion of Afghanistan, Carter canceled grain shipments to the U.S. and he canceled U.S. participation in the Olympic Games, but he offered no other sanctions. And so it looked like he was punishing the grain farmers of the U.S. and the Olympics of the Olympians of the U.S. and wasn't getting anything in return from the Russians. And finally, in 1979, I guess I could switch these two, but probably his most important foreign policy disaster was the attempted rescue of the American hostages held for well over a year by the Iranian revolutionaries and its abject failure. When Carter ran against Reagan in 1980, then this was used to beat him about the head and shoulders during the campaign. Reagan won reasonably handily, and almost immediately after the election, the Iranians released the hostages. Well, it certainly appears that the presidencies of President Ford and Carter from 1974, until 1981, then were the rulings of, or the rulings, the terms of incompetence. History will have to see, but at this point, we can say there were only a couple of successes, at least in the short term. And with that, I'll say again, thank you for your attention.